Alright, so this is the first video in my How to Play Yu-Gi-Oh series. In this video, I'll just be going over some basics. And the first thing I want to cover is the zones on the mats. So when you play Yu-Gi-Oh, usually it's easier to use a play mat. And you can get these in something as simple as a starter deck or a structure deck. They'll usually come with one. And so on the playmats, there are 5 monster zones, so you can have up to 5 monsters at once. These are monsters. So there's 2 main types of monsters that you'll play in the main deck. There will be normal monsters, which are kind of a yellowish color, and then there are effect monsters, which are more orangish. I'll go much more into monsters in the next video. And then the next main zones, there are 5, once again, these are spell and trap card zones, so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those as well. And as you might expect, you play spell and trap cards in these. So spell cards are green, like this, and trap cards are pinkish, like this. As far as the other zones go, over here you have the deck zone. This is where you place your deck. And a deck will be between 40 and 60 cards. You can play any number in between there, but usually it's recommended that you only play 40. So this is where you put your deck at the start of the game. Above that, you have the graveyard. So whenever a monster is destroyed, say you have a Hanzo on the field, which is this monster, and it gets destroyed, then it'll go to the graveyard right there. And anytime you use a spell or trap card, say you activate Upstart, it would go to the graveyard after being used up. And say you activated Mirror Force, likewise it would go to the graveyard after being used up. So you would have these 3 cards in your graveyard at that point. The next zone I want to talk about is the Banished Zone. So this is a zone that's actually not included on most playmats. I usually put my deck slightly down and my graveyard slightly down to put room up here for the Banished Zone. So cards ordinarily do not become banished, but there are effects that can cause cards to somehow be banished. So for example, summoning this monster requires you to banish a monster from your grave. So in this case, the Hanzo would have to go to the Banished Zone. In my next video on monsters, I'll get more into summoning monsters with special conditions, such as this card right here. And then on the other side of the board, you have the extra deck zone. This is where you place extra deck monsters. You can play up to 15 of these. Usually it's recommended that you play exactly 15 because you want to take advantage of that. And the types of cards that you can play in there are fusion monsters, which are purple, synchro monsters, which are white, and Exceed monsters, which are black. The last zone that's on this mat is the field card zone. The field spells are also magic cards, so they're green as well, though these cards can only be played in this one zone, and you can only have one at a time. I'll get more into field spells in the later video on spell cards. The last 2 zones are not on this mat, but they are on newer mats. So they would go right here and right here. So kind of in between the monsters and the spells, and it kind of just pushes out these 2 zones higher and lower, and it would push the graveyard farther out and the deck, so you'd have more space right there. These 2 zones are for pendulum cards, which are half monster and half spell. So you can play these as normal monsters, so just summon them as a monster, or you can play it as a spell, in which case it'll go in the pendulum zone here, or in the pendulum zone here. You can only have 2 pendulum spells activated at one time. Once again, I'll go further into detail on this once I get to that in a later video. To give you a little bit more context for how all of these cards function, the monsters that you'll end up playing, you will be using to try to attack your opponent which will reduce their life points. Each time you do damage to them, it'll reduce their life points, which start at 8,000, and your goal is to try to get your opponent's 8,000 life points down to 0. So for example, Hanzo can do a maximum of 1,800 damage, so you would have potentially 5 attacks to try to get your opponent's 8,000 down to 0. Your spell cards you primarily play on your turn to try to give you some form of advantage. A lot of times spell cards will help you search through your deck or draw additional cards. And then trap cards you primarily use on your opponent's turn to try to, as the name suggests, get them to fall into a trap. Now I will briefly go through all of the phases. The first phase is the draw phase. So during this phase, you get to draw one card from your deck. I would like to note that at the start of each duel, both players start with 5 cards. And the person who goes first does not draw during the draw phase, but the person who goes second will draw 1 card during their draw phase, and each subsequent draw phase, each player will draw 1 card. Following the draw phase is the standby phase. Usually there are not too many things that happen during the standby phase, but sometimes there will be cards that specifically tell you to do something during the standby phase. For example, with this card, you have to pay 100 life points each standby phase or destroy it. So most cards that require you to do something during the standby phase will tell you on the card. The next phase is the main phase 1. During this phase, you can summon monsters, you can activate spell cards, and you can also set trap cards to activate later. Following the main phase is the battle phase. And during this phase, your monsters can attack your opponent's monsters, or if they don't have any monsters, you can attack your opponent directly. Following the battle phase is the main phase 2, in which you can perform the same actions that you do during the main phase 1. And then following this is the last phase, the end phase. This is like the standby phase where there are often not many things happening, but there are once again certain effects that tell you to do something during the end phase. For example, Lila, during the end phase, says to mill 3 cards off the top of your deck, which simply means send the top 3 cards from your deck to the graveyard. Also, during your own end phase, if you have more than 6 cards in your hand, say you have 7, like there are right here, you're required to discard cards from your hand to the graveyard until you have only 6 left in your hand. Each of these phases is mandatory unless you decide to proceed directly from main phase 1 to the end phase. In that case, you can skip your battle phase and your main phase 2. However, that's the only way you are able to skip any of the phases. If you go to your battle phase, you have to go to main phase 2 before going to the end phase. As far as the basics go, that about covers most of it. In the next few videos, I'll be going much more in depth on how monster cards, spell cards, and trap cards work, as well as how the monsters from the extra deck work. In this video, there's a few other topics I'd just like to cover on briefly that I think should be covered in the basics video. The first one is certain cards are either forbidden or limited. Cards like the Dijin, Releaser of Rituals, are forbidden, which means that you can't play any during a duel. And other cards like Soul Charge are limited, which means you can only play 1 in your deck. Cards like these are either forbidden or limited because they're just simply too powerful at higher numbers. The majority of cards you are allowed to play up to 3 copies of. I will also, in a later video, go more in depth on the forbidden and limited list. And then the rest of this video is just odds and ends tips for newer players. One thing that you may have noticed is I have these cards in sleeves. So this is to protect the cards. When they're in sleeves, the sleeves get damaged instead of the cards. So just as an example, this card is a card I use a lot, but because it's in a sleeve, it is still in good condition. So you can see like the corners aren't worn down or anything. And here's a card that when I was a younger kid I played without putting it in a sleeve. And so if you look at it, you can see, I'm not sure how well it shows up on the camera, but you can kind of see the corners are like whitish because they're dulled. And there's also a bend in the card right there. I'm not really sure how well this is being picked up on the camera, but the point remains that the cards do get beat up if you don't put them in sleeves. So putting them in sleeves does a lot to help maintain your cards in good condition. Each time you shuffle your deck, you're required to present your deck to your opponent, who can then cut your deck, and they can also shuffle your deck if they like. But a lot of times what players will do in the middle of a game is just cut it once to help speed the game along. The other tip for newer players is to, if you're not familiar with the card, just read the whole card. I know that sounds really basic, but it really help you to not get caught off guard. It might make duels a little bit slower at first, but after you see cards a few times, then you'll start to become more comfortable and familiar with them. The next thing I wanted to mention is how you get cards. So the two primary ways of getting new cards are either buying packs or buying individual cards online. So the main problem with buying packs is it's very random. So this is a pack that I got at the sneak peek the other day, and if you open it up, you'll get 9 cards in it. So you'll get 4 commons, a rare, and then you could get 4 commons or a holographic card and then 3 commons. A lot of times you'll end up getting no holographic cards. For reference, in case you didn't know, a holographic card is one that's shiny. The picture will be shiny, and those are harder to get, and usually the better cards are holographic, but not always. So a lot of times you'll end up getting no holographics in your pack, which is one of the main downsides to buying packs. If you want specific cards, it's much easier to get them if you buy them as individual cards. There are exceptions to this, however, as things like structure decks, for example, tell you exactly which cards you're getting, and sometimes the cards you need will be exactly the ones that are in the structure deck. Another way that you can get cards is by trading for them with other players, and the one thing I would recommend for trading is to look up prices. TCG Player is a good resource, as they have a lot of different sites prices listed on their site. So when making trades with people, I would recommend looking up the prices on TCG Player to make sure that you're making a fair trade where the prices are relatively close. And the last topic I wanted to touch on in this intro video is stealing. So there is a bit of an issue within the Yu-Gi-Oh community with stealing, and as long as you're careful, you should probably be fine. The one thing I highly recommend doing is when you're playing to wrap your backpack around your leg. This way it's much more difficult for someone to try to steal your backpack. This is especially an issue if you plan on playing at a larger event with more people, because with more people there, the higher the likelihood that there are dishonest players there. I know that sounds bad. Most players do have good intentions, but you have to be careful and try to protect yourself from the players who want to try to take advantage of you. And just make sure that your stuff is never out of your sight. So that's all the topics I wanted to cover in my intro video. In the next couple of videos, I'll get more in depth into some of the topics. Coming up next will be closer look at monster cards.